Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. Listen for the word of the living God as we read these words. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The living God still speaks today. Thanks be to God. It's easy for us to tune people out, isn't it? We don't necessarily mean to. We figure we know what they're going to say, and we turn them into background noise. It's hard to set aside our focus, our issues, our concerns, and our experiences to listen deeply enough to hear another person. That's even more the case when what is being presented breaks with our expectations. When we encounter brand new concepts, they don't filter down to our understanding and comprehension immediately. We have to process. We have to consider them. It takes effort. Effort to process new concepts. It often takes time. We only learn quickly when we are being exposed to tidbits of new information. And we don't necessarily learn a whole lot from them. How can we ever get past ourselves to see the world and people with Jesus' eyes? Jesus' death is not inseparably tied to concepts of eternity in God's presence, in some celestial sphere we call heaven. We make the association because our understandings developed with the full gospel story in our reach. We make the connection from this side of Jesus' resurrection. The first century Jews, however, had no such associations to which they might link Jesus' death to any fulfillment of God's reign. As Jesus spoke with his disciples here about his oncoming death, he had not yet engaged the concept of eternity lived in God's presence. According to John, that doesn't come till the last night they're together. He was simply expressing the necessity for Messiah to die at human hands. His subsequent resurrection would then serve as a prelude to their accepting what it meant for him to be Messiah. They were all well aware that Jesus faced opposition. They did not really understand the extremes to which that opposition was willing to go. much less that in killing Jesus they would reveal their hand as having no power over Jesus or over God's reign. No one taught me to write research papers in first grade. We were still working on learning the letters, their associated sounds, beginning to put them together to form words. Before I could learn to research, write papers, document sources, and put together a book, there were a host of other steps I needed to master. To get to Jesus' messianic identity, these disciples needed to understand that while death did not mesh with their assumptions and their expectations, it was one step along this path to God's reign and would not invalidate God's plans and purposes. That was a major step. Death was not the only issue for which they needed to be prepared. It was not the only concern that they would need to move past. To understand Jesus as Messiah and the structure of God's reign as a whole, they needed to put aside a lot of expectations. One of these was the question of power and authority and their relation to love, service, humility. These questions did not necessarily depend on Jesus' impending death, but embracing them made his death acceptable as an aspect of his messianic identity. Embracing the expectations Jesus was handing them redefined what God's reign was, what it could be, what it should be. Today's passage has Jesus responding to their concerns over power. It's as prevalent a concern today as it was then, including among people claiming to follow Jesus. Exerting or wielding power over others, however, is antithetical to the purposes and character of love. Love gives of itself. Power and force take. They tie others into submission. They seek to restrain others, while love seeks to enable, empower, and set free. When what we call love is controlling, it's not love at all. It's abuse. The disciples wanted power. They wanted control. They wanted others to serve them, to meet their needs and wants, to pay them deference. They were interested in position, for they were interested in dominance. While Jesus had been talking about his life being taken from him, others seeking to gain control over his actions, his reputation, his impact, his very life, the 12 were looking for the very same things in relation to other participants in God's reign. That Jesus was speaking of his impending death just did not make any sense to them. It did not fit into their paradigm of God's reign. They were looking for a messianic reign that was modeled after the norms of Roman occupation. Hellenic dominance under Alexander the Great, the expansion of the Babylonian Empire across their known world, But Jesus had been teaching about love, forgiveness, peace, humility, and responding to the needs of individuals with grace and compassion. That had not yet affected what they expected in regard to God's reign. Perhaps these were side benefits of God's reign for those on the inside, while all outsiders were trampled on and oppressed. Meanwhile, Jesus speaks of his being trampled, of his being oppressed by others, and accepting it. Their working definition for greatness was borrowed from Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Greece, Rome. They had not yet come to recognize that Jesus used a completely different criteria for greatness. One that coincided with those other things that he had been teaching about. Greatness, he says, is about loving one another with abandon. Greatness is about giving up our wealth for the benefit of the poor. Greatness was about setting aside one's plans to meet the needs of a stranger in need. Greatness was about touching lepers, feeding hungry crowds, encouraging the poor, welcoming the unlovely, and moving past condemnation to welcome inclusion. Greatness was about serving those with no means to repay or serve us in return. He took a small child in his arms and he held the child before them, saying, "Whoever welcomes one such as this in my name, my authority, welcomes me and the one who sent me." That's akin to the way Bucky would take Victoria's hand, walk her with him to light the candles, to take up the offering, to serve communion. It's akin to the way you reached out to offer shelter to a neighbor and his family in desperate need of a place to stay. It's akin to how you allowed a stranger and her dog to find shelter in our fellowship hall, along with making sure that she had food, blankets, dog food, and a way to apply for a new place to live. These structures in which we study, sing, hold card-making classes, and make space for Girl Scouts, worship, and welcome celebrating or grieving families in our midst, they are not the church. They are just tools. They're resources in our hands that we use as the church, as the hands and feet of Christ in our community. You've seen people sleeping on the bench outside our fellowship hall. Rather than run them off, you have sought to provide a container in which they could keep clothes out of the rain. You've made sure our blessings box is stocked and has items appropriate to help these and others who come onto this, our campus. This is what Jesus was talking about, even when the disciples could not grasp it. Columbia, South Carolina made it illegal to be downtown and not have proof of some residence. Fort Lauderdale, Florida made it illegal to feed people who were unhoused. Charlotte, North Carolina, has destroyed Tent City on multiple occasions, seeking to wield power and force to respond to a problem of economic need and inequality. These are not the ways of God's reign. God's reign calls on us to feed the hungry, house those who lack shelter, clothe, heal, and otherwise care for all of our neighbors. It's too easy to just tune people out along with their needs. It's too easy to look right past the injustices all around us that we simply take for granted. That's just the way it is. It's too simple for us to concern ourselves merely with our own issues, becoming self-absorbed to the exclusion of extending God's reign all around us. Power and force, those are tools of exclusion. They keep people at bay, keep people out. God's reign takes the opposite tact of including all those that we would otherwise exclude and serve them with love. Where do we still need to look upon others? With the eyes of Jesus rather than our own.